Joining us right now is Cornell law professor William Jacobson. He's not just a law professor. He also writes a terrific blog called Legal Insurrection, where he takes all kinds of interesting takes on current events. William Jacobson is a clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell Law School. He's a 1984 graduate of the Harvard Law School, where he was a senior editor of the Harvard International Law Journal and director of litigation for the Harvard Prison Legal Assistance Project. And he's been teaching at Cornell since 2007. Professor, thanks for joining us today.
Be here.
All right. So you have uncovered a really interesting race hoax at Oberlin College out in Ohio. Tell us a little bit about what happened and how you determined this was a hoax and what the ramifications of all this are.
Sure. Your listeners may or may not recall that last February and early March of 2003, there were massive protests on the Oberlin campus, and it was all over the national news because somebody at Oberlin had been posting flyers and graffiti, very racist, very anti-Semitic, anti-gay, really some rough stuff all over the campus. And so there was this whole issue coming up about, who was doing it, why was it being done, et cetera, et cetera. And it was portrayed as somebody on campus or group of students who actually felt the way they felt. And that obviously created a lot of issues on campus, and to the extent that they even canceled classes for a day on March 4th and had protests and sit-ins and so-called conversations and meetings and all those sort of things. And it was all over the place, everywhere.
And Oberlin isn't exactly a hotbed of conservatism, is it?
No, it's a small, extremely liberal, college in Ohio, which has a reputation of being very quote-unquote progressive and very racially tolerant. I believe that it was the first college to, and I may be getting this slightly wrong, I think to admit blacks, 100 years ago or whenever it was, 150 years ago. So it had this history of being a racially progressive institution, and that was kind of its persona. So this was completely out of place for that campus, and it caused a lot of headlines and a lot of news.
Now go ahead.
So at the time, there were some rumors that I heard that that this was not what it appeared to be, that this might be a hoax. And there have been a number of incidents on campuses over the last couple of decades where there have been essentially fake hate crimes. And it's not perpetrated by any one race or religion. There are Jewish people who, for whatever their reason, will want to get attention and put a swastika on their door, or a black person who will create some sort of other incident. And there's, a history of this thing. Certainly not the majority of incidents, but there is this history of campus hoaxes. And we are beginning to hear that. There was some chatter out there. And we tried to get answers from the Oberlin administration, and they just completely shut down. They wouldn't address it. They wouldn't deny it. They wouldn't confirm it. And they allowed these protests to go on in the student reaction as if these were actual bias sort of statements.
At what point did you start hearing this chatter that maybe this was a hoax?
Right at the time, right around March 4th.
And where did that grapevine come from?
Well, there were some student. I think there was a student chat board where people were making that suggestion, but most importantly, the Oberlin town police, not the campus police, the town police issued a statement saying that the motives were unclear of the people behind it. So that's when, that was like a red flag to me. What do you mean the motives are unclear? And so that's when I tried to get answers from the Oberlin administration, and they just would not let on one way or the other. And they allowed all these protests and all these students on campus to think that these were real, that there really was a Nazi sympathizer on campus. There really was somebody, who was suggesting, all sorts of crazy things regarding blacks, and they allowed that to happen. And it was only recently discovered when the police report was obtained by someone who works for the Daily Caller website that in the police report, the student admits right there that he did this as a prank.
We're speaking with Cornell law professor William Jacobson. He also writes a wonderful blog called Legal Insurrection, and he's been following a case of racism hoax, quite frankly, from Oberlin College in Ohio since February. What got you interested in this? Why did this rise to the level for you to say, wait a minute, I gotta start looking into this and make some noise?
Well, I have followed at my blog almost since the inception in October 2008 the issue of the false accusations of racism and how it plays into the political system. I mean, we see on MSNBC virtually every day, if not every day, attempts to portray policy differences as racially motivated. So if you're opposed to Obamacare, that must be because you're racist. And that goes on all the time. And so I was very sensitive to this issue, that this is something that obviously, if it were true, it deserved the attention that it got, but it just didn't smell right. And when the university would not give out any information or identify anything or even confirm that they, what the motive was, that just said to me that there's something very wrong here. And I kept after them for a number of months, and they continually refused to give any information.
Did they even return your phone calls?
It took a while. I mean, most of it was by email with their press spokesman, but yes, they generally will respond, but it takes a while. But when you get with what you get with the response is generally not very informative.
Why would Oberlin, what would they have to gain by not owning up to what was going on?
I have no idea. It really makes no sense. I think that part of what it was, based on my numerous communications with them, every time I either speak to them or email with them, they frequently invoke the issue of educational privacy. Maybe they were afraid of lawsuits. Who knows? But, this was something where they could have generically issued a statement saying that, we know who's behind it, or we believe we know who's behind it, and we believe we know what their motivations are, and while we're dealing with it internally and we can't disclose names, we can tell you that we believe this was just a prank by somebody not motivated by racism or anti-Semitism or anything like that.
And this
that would have changed the discussion very dramatically.
And it could have happened as early as February, right?
It could have happened in February. We know for a fact, in fact, I just posted on my website portions of the police report. By February 27th, they had identified the two people based on surveillance video and eyewitness accounts of people who saw them putting up flyers around campus. And what's very interesting is that at least we know a lot about one of the people because he had a fairly significant online presence, and he's an Obama supporter. He worked for Obama in high school. He formed a high school group, whatever it was, high schoolers for Obama. He worked on the Obama campaign last summer. He holds himself out as an anti-racist activist. So this, not only was this a prank or a hoax or whatever you want to call it, it was the worst type because it was perpetrated by somebody who does not fit the description of who should be doing this. And I think it would have played out. I mean, if Oberlin had come out on March 4th, the day they canceled classes, or the day before, and say, nothing to worry about here because, this was somebody who's not racist. In fact, it would have just changed the whole dialogue. And I think it's very significant that this was a very legitimately disturbing series of incidents for students on campus. And really, this was, very widespread on campus. I mean, hundreds of flyers, graffiti, emails, things like that. It wasn't just one or two things. And, there are students who were legitimately and honestly in their own minds upset and fearful and I hate to use the word traumatized, but, upset about, being called these names in this hostile environment needlessly because, the fact that it's a prank does not excuse it, but it puts a very different flavor on it.
Is there any suggestion that the two perpetrators were actually trying to make some sort of a political point, or were they just doing it for yucks?
Well, that's a little unclear. What they told the police and what Oberlin was aware of, or at least what one of them told the police and Oberlin was aware of, is that he was doing it, essentially, he used the word trolling. So if you understand what trolling is on the Internet,
Mm-hmm.
it's often presenting yourself as somebody you are not in order to blow up the discussion on a comment section of a blog or wherever it happens to be, just to kind of get a rise out of people. And he said that he was doing that that he was essentially trolling, and then he was doing it because he felt that there was an overreaction to prior statements around campus that he denied being involved in, and that's questionable. I think there's some evidence and to believe that these two were behind all of them, but in any event, that was his explanation to the police. That, of course, so he was trying to portray it as almost like a free speech sort of thing.
Almost like performance art or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure that makes sense. I don't know whether that's true or not, but there was nothing in his background that would have led Oberlin to think he was believing what he was writing. And there was an enormous amount of stuff in his background where Oberlin could have concluded two things. One, this was a hoax and a prank, even though a stupid prank, that he was not actually motivated by racism or anti-Semitism or anything like that. And that would have just changed the whole way this thing went down. And I think Oberlin needs to explain why they didn't give that explanation.
Let's talk about that for a second. We are speaking with William Jacobson. He's a professor of law at Cornell University, also writes a wonderful blog called Legal Insurrection. So who really jumped on this from the news media?
Well, at the time, it was all over. I mean, it was MSNBC, CNN. Everybody was covering the events on campus as if these were really actions motivated by racists on campus. But then it dropped. Once it dropped off the radar completely. And really, I think, myself and maybe a couple of other conservative bloggers were really the only ones following up on it. By April, there was virtually no news coverage anymore of it. It was just one of these things kind of data banked in everybody's memory that, yes, racism exists even at a place like Oberlin College, and, do with that what you want politically. But none of the news media followed up on it.
Do you suppose that they may have started to smell a rat themselves and decided to distance themselves from the story?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I do know that nobody followed up on it. And in fact, I've emailed probably a dozen or more reporters who covered the story back in March. I emailed them in the last day or two saying, hey, here's new information. How about updating your story? Because
what kind of reaction did that get?
Well, I haven't heard back from anybody. No one's responded to my emails. I can tell you the only one, and good for them, the only one that I know of that actually updated this story, they did it late yesterday, was the Associated Press. I contacted their Cleveland office, actually their Columbus office. I sent them the information. I said, hey, you covered this and presented it one way. Here's what's come out. It's not true. And AP did cover it. I haven't seen that AP report picked up any place other than a television station in, I think it was Cleveland, but it is an AP story. So good for AP. They did update it. That update was picked up by a local television station. But New York Times I contacted. As far as I know, they've not done anything. Boston Globe, Huffington Post, several other magazines. Also, in fairness, there's a writer for the Atlantic magazine, Connor Friedersdorf. I think that's how it's pronounced. And he had written about it back then. I emailed him, and he wrote a follow-up to it. So there has been a little bit of responsiveness, but the main newspapers, I contacted the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I didn't check their website today. I don't know whether they've updated it, but I contacted them. There was a newspaper in Akron. Again, I can't remember the name of it, but whatever, I think it may be the Dispatch. I emailed the people there, I think the editors, because I couldn't find the email for the reporter. So, I've reached out to a lot of people, and it's out there in the Internet, but mostly through conservative blogs. Other than AP, I don't know any mainstream media outlet that has picked up on the fact that this was a hoax.
We're speaking with Cornell law professor William Jacobson. He writes a wonderful blog called Legal Insurrection. Google that. It's always entertaining and always interesting. So you're going to keep. I imagine the next step in this story for you is going to be to sort of watch the media and what they do with it over the next week or two.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it, as well as to find out how the Oberlin administration is going to respond to the fact that it's now out in the open. I contacted several members of the Board of Trustees, only one of whom would speak with me, and only very briefly until he realized exactly what the problem was here. So it's unclear whether the Board of Trustees was aware that this was a hoax. I don't know whether they did or they didn't. Oberlin has told me that those are confidential communications and will not be disclosed. I've asked the press spokesman by email for Oberlin to explain why the president of the university didn't just come out and tell everybody this was a cruel prank and a cruel hoax, rather than letting everybody proceed thinking it was for real. I've not received a response to it.
I'll bet we'll find out about it if you do, though. And I got to leave it there.
Okay, great.
Really appreciate your being here. That's Professor William Jacobson. He is a professor of law at Cornell University over in Ithaca, New York.